I'm excited to present our next C-level panel today, which is Communicating Cyber Risk to the Board and the Business, How is it Changing? Every year, FAIRCON continues to update itself on the best practices in this field, and this session maintains that evolution without communicating cyber risk to the board and the business. So, led by moderator Julian Meyrick, Managing Partner and Vice President of Security Strategy and Risk and Compliance at IBM, please let me welcome and introduce the panelists to the stage. We got James Lame, multiple-time board director and ERM author, Michael Meis, Associate CISO at KU Health, and Evan Wheeler, Senior Director, Technology Risk Management, Capital One.
Sorry, I need the clicker.
There you go, Julian.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. Good morning and welcome to this panel. And I really feel this is a topic that has been referred to pretty regularly over the sessions yesterday. So I'm delighted to be joined by my panelist colleagues. So shall I just ask you briefly to introduce yourselves? James, do you want to go first?
Sure. My name's James Lamb. Very nice to be with you today. Thank you for the FAIR Institute for inviting me. My background's always been in risk management, specifically enterprise risk management. So I've been a chief risk officer at Fidelity Investments and GE Capital. I've been a consultant for the last 21 years. I've had my own consulting practice. And prior to that, I was a partner at Oliver Wyman. And I've also been a corporate director at public and private companies, serving as the chair of the board, chair of the risk committee, and chair of the audit committee.
Well, it's unfortunate I have to follow that up. My name is Michael Meis. I've been in information security for about 13 years. The majority of that was in the federal IT space, mostly in incident response and a little bit in the identity and compliance space. I spent 2 years at H&R Block where I rebuilt their GRC program, and then for the last year I have been at the University of Kansas Health System leading our cybersecurity program. I'm also one of the co-chairs of the Kansas City chapter of the FAIR Institute.
Hi everyone, Evan Wheeler. I've been a longtime evangelist and advocate of FAIR since the pretty early days of it. Worked in several different financial services firms in both cyber and technology risk management and also operational risk management, leveraging FAIR as our framework, and have built out about 5 or 6 different flavors of programs based on that. And right now I'm also an advisor to the FAIR Institute.
And I've been focused on cybersecurity for the last 10 years at IBM, and delighted to be a member of the industry advisory group for the FAIR Institute. So, as I think that the topic of this panel has really come up pretty regularly in sessions so far. And so what we wanted to do was frame it a little bit. And I thought it was great that actually Larry Clinton yesterday brought up the World Economic Forum and NACD principles for board governance of cyber risk. So we want to kind of highlight that and use that as the basis for this particular panel. So I just want to highlight the 5 principles for board governance, and these are the ones that we're going to talk about in terms of our questions. So if I can start first with you, James, and what do you see in your experience? What is the role of the board in terms of cybersecurity oversight?
Yeah, I think the role of the board is really about risk governance and risk oversight. So management is management's responsibility. And let me just start by giving you my key takeaways. Usually a speaker would give you the key takeaways at the end. I think it's much better to do in the beginning, right? Your mind's fresh, you don't have any information overload. So let's show hands. How many of you have supported board level risk reporting? And how many of you have been presenting to the board? Okay, So let me just give you 3 don'ts and 5 things that you should consider doing in your risk reporting. So the 3 don'ts are: don't do stupid, don't do lazy, and don't do boring. And let me go into each one, because I've been at board meetings that a week later I can't remember what was presented to me. Okay, that's not good, right? So don't do stupid. To me, what's stupid is risk assessments that are qualitatively based. Stupid is doing that risk assessment, summarizing in a heat map. Okay. Let me first say that I'm not a critic of risk assessments that are well done or heat maps in terms of the format, but generally, when you rate probability 1 to 5, severity from 1 to 5, you multiply the 2 with a risk score. And I think Jack Jones did a really good job saying this is silly math. And directors recognize that. All right? So, give you an example: probability and severity of a breach attempt that you've been able to block. 1. Probability is a 5, right? It happens all the time. Severity is a 1. 5 times 1 is a 5. What's the probability and severity of a major data breach? Probability is low, severity is high. 1 times 5 is a 5. The underlying math is stupid. And just because you put it in a heat map doesn't make it any better, okay? So 1 is don't do stupid. 2 is don't do lazy. What is lazy? Lazy is describing risk as a non-performance of a business objective. And you see this in risk disclosures and 10Ks all the time, right? We want to achieve certain market share. What's the risk? That we don't achieve market share. In IT, one of your key objectives is to keep the systems up and running in terms of availability. Uptime. What's the risk? Downtime. No, that's really lazy thinking. The risk is not downtime. The risks are the underlying conditions and variables that would lead to downtime. Some of those conditions and variables are internal, some are external, some are controllable, some are not controllable. Think about risk that way, and don't do lazy thinking. Lastly, don't do boring, okay? Many of you present to the board, and the 3 things that you present, what are the major accomplishments that we've had since the last time we presented? What are the project plans? What are work plans? What are the progress reports? Last time we were 70% done, now it's 80% done. Let me tell you something. To the average board director, that is boring. We don't care, all right? We don't want to sit there listening to you. We don't want to sit there spending our time listening to you in terms of how you spent your time. Okay, we're just going to assume that you've done your job and you've done it well. That's why you're there. What we want to know is, are you doing your jobs effectively? So it's very important to step back and think about your reporting and metrics. Don't do stupid. Don't do lazy. Don't do boring. Okay. Now let me tell you quickly what are things that you should consider putting into your report. One is, tell me about the threat environment. Okay, I'm not going to show you an interest rate risk report without talking about the interest rates environment, the yield curve, volatilities. What's going on in the threat environment? Are there any major breaches? What are the trends in ransomware? What are the trends in attacks in our industry? What are the things that we should really be concerned about? 2 is, what's our cyber risk profile from an outside-in independent perspective? That would be your security ratings. That would be any independent assessment in terms of penetration testing, right? Or any kind of regulatory reviews. 3 is, what is the cyber risk profile from an inside-out perspective, right? That would include your NIST maturity. That would include any assessment of your current capabilities against your threats, might be even internal audit type of reports. but that's an inside-out perspective. 4 is where FAIR comes in. What is the cyber risk quantification? Right, at the start, you might have some KRI, some key risk metrics, some early warning metrics, and finally, what is the potential economic loss in terms of your risk? And number 5 is the most important, and that is around decision making. What are the decisions that you're making in terms of cyber risk management? Insurance, new controls, what's the risk-adjusted return of our businesses? Because we take risks to be in business. What are the risk-adjusted return? And how you're making those decisions, and that's the role of the board. It's really to oversee the decision-making of management and get a good sense of what that looks like. So I just want to contrast what not to do and what to do. I have a copy of a report that I think is great. And I have a hard stop at 10:45, so if I walk off stage, it's not because of you, it's me. I have an 11 o'clock board meeting. But I'm around at lunch, and if you're interested in taking a quick look at the report, be happy to show it to you, Mary. Okay, anyway, that's an overview.
Thank you, James. So Michael, can you share a few of your insights from your experience of how does the board really look at this cybersecurity oversight?
So the first thing that I always kind of share with everyone when it comes to board reporting, and James touched on it as well, is they don't care. They don't care about cybersecurity inherently, and they're never going to. Cybersecurity and information security is a necessary evil that is a byproduct of the threat environment that we operate in. It's become a necessary part of business, but it's not something that anybody on your board wants to do or wants to care about or is happy they have to care about it. And so by first understanding that that's the space we play in, it is important that we act appropriately. And so, like James was talking about, we have to keep our message simple but not stupid, very succinct, and being able to tell a story about what we are doing to minimize that necessary evil and empower the business to be able to do the things they actually want to do, which is achieve their strategic objectives. And so the more you can show that alignment in that story that you're telling, the more you're going to get buy-in from the board because they will see you as a business leader instead of as a security leader. So you have to go in with that story. You have to bring data to back it up, which is where FAIR becomes very important as well, is it provides some of that translation between the typical security metrics that all of us have used in the past and the same method of reporting that every other line of business is using, which is monetary modeling. The other thing that I always recommend to everyone is to keep your board report no more than 3 slides, because typically you'll have 15, maybe 20 minutes to report to the board. And so if you're using more than 3 slides, it usually means you're telling more story than what they need to hear. And so I like to use 1 slide to cover the threat environment that James talked about, 1 slide to talk about our current, where we're at right now, which is where we use FAIR, to be able to talk about how much risk we're currently carrying within our organization, and then another one to talk about the future, which is, again, to paint that picture for them, paint us the story about where we're headed and how that's going to impact our strategic objectives for the organization.
Thank you. Evan, how about your insight into experience of this in communicating to the board?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I'll build on of what's been talked about already. One is to point out that not every board is the same and every corporate culture is going to vary a little bit as well. So I think sometimes we talk about this in the terms of like there's one kind of template for a board and what they care about and how they like to operate and how they like to receive that information. So I think it's important to kind of understand your corporate culture as well. I agree with the succinctness and all that, but I've also seen organizations where it's normal to provide thousands of pages and reports and things to the board that they read in advance, and then maybe you get 10 minutes or 15 minutes to highlight some of those as, actually in front of them. So there's going to be different strategies that you follow depending on the type of corporate culture you have. The other thing that I would say as well is that I have found that almost in every board, there's one de facto like technology or cyber person that all the other board members have kind of decided is there one person to ask the hard questions about that. And you'll usually find that person the first time you're presenting, because everyone will almost turn in the room and look at them and wait for them to start drilling you with whatever they've heard in the news or whatever they've experienced at their own firm or whatever they just happen to be worried about. So I think a lot of the board interaction also needs to happen outside of the boardroom as well, for building relationships with those people, educating them on where your program is going and your framework and kind of your philosophy of things, and getting input from them of what they're really interested in, especially if they're active in another organization. Understanding the profile of that organization and what's going on with them, because a lot of times they're going to bring that into the boardroom as some of the things they're going to drill you on. If their company just had a third-party outage that was in the news, guess what? The next board meeting, they're going to be asking you about third-party risk and those kinds of things. So be flexible and cater your style to the culture of your organization. And the other thing I would also add is the more we automate, the more frequently we are interacting with the board, the more we're going to have to automate the data and the metrics and everything that's supporting that. That also comes with its own risk of poor data governance and poor data quality. It's so embarrassing to have to go back and correct last quarter's report because you got something materially wrong in a metric or whatever you were reporting to them. So, as we start to get this data and automate that and get a regular cadence of reporting it to the board, also make sure that your data governance is maturing along with that, so you don't have those embarrassing moments of having to go back and correct things that you've been reporting.
Absolutely.
Hey, Julian, let me just add to what Michael said. I would say board members care about cybersecurity a lot. We don't care about the sausage making. We don't care about how you do cybersecurity. We do care that the sausage tastes good and safe to eat, okay? So, you look at NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. It's an association of over 21,000 corporate directors, biggest one in the world, very active. And we heard yesterday from Larry Clinton that the cybersecurity handbook is the most read document that is in that community. So we care about a lot, but what we care about is how could we add value to the process. And when you think about the role of the board, we approve policies that management develops, risk escalation policies, risk acceptance policies, risk appetite statements and metrics and tolerances. Those are the things that we could have an impact on. And I would say we really care about cybersecurity a lot as an issue. We used to think about it once a year. Now it's almost every quarter. But we should present information to the board relative to what their role is. So we don't care about the sausage making. So I agree with Mike on that. But as an issue, we really care about it a lot.
So James, you mentioned risk appetite, and that's one of the principles of board governance here on the screen. How would you see a board should determine what that risk appetite, risk tolerance is for the organization?
Yeah, so risk appetite statement basically says what risks are we willing to accept, what types of risks at what level in pursuit of our business strategy, and that includes your digital strategy, any digital transformation. And it's not enough to just have a statement that says, we have a low risk appetite, but what are the metrics that would express that risk appetite in quantitative terms, right? So that would include any kind of key risk indicators, whether it's phishing fail rates or patching cadence. It would also include any potential loss using FAIR to do scenario analysis. Is our risk appetite $50 million? Is it $100 million? Well, how do we consider that? And how do we create dashboard reporting to the board that includes those metrics? But without risk appetite statement, I don't think any cybersecurity program or ERM program is sufficient.
And for me, this is pretty fundamental, and where FAIR is really, really powerful is acceptance that there are risks that you are just going to have to accept as an organization. Risk is never, ever going to go to zero. And I think actually most organizations, when they're looking at enterprise risk, they look at that across other parts of their risk portfolio as well. So cyber needs to be aligned with that. Michael, is that your experience as well? How do you see risk appetite or risk tolerance being defined in the organization?
Yeah, I completely agree with James. I think it's really the fundamental underpinning of what victory criteria is for your security team is that risk appetite. And so if you don't have it, you're essentially moving forward in an unknown direction towards an unknown goal. And so it's important to have a risk appetite statement that you're able to measure against, which if we're using something qualitative like low medium, for example, which we see in a lot of organizations, there's no way to measure yourself against that. So it's important that we have risk appetite done qualitatively. This is where you can partner a lot with your business continuity and disaster recovery teams to use like the organizational business impact analysis to understand like what is a catastrophic loss for the organization. And it's often a good starting point for your risk appetite statement that you can then start refining down using FAIR and using some of your KRIs to better understand indicators of approaching that appetite or key inflection points that would push the organization toward that type of a loss event. So it's not something you have to do in a vacuum and tackle all yourself like sometimes we often try to do in security. And if you can partner with one of those other groups and use that BIA, it'll really make your life a lot easier and is a fantastic starting point for developing risk appetite for the organization.
Evan, so what's your experience of helping people understand the risk appetite and where you stand against it?
Yeah, I really see the risk appetite or tolerance, however you want to define it, as really the core of any program. Unfortunately, I see a lot of programs come to that towards the end of building the program as opposed to at the beginning. And obviously, based on what we've talked about today, that's very backwards to start identifying where some of your weaknesses are and where your issues are and where you think you have gaps without a concept of what are the bounds you're trying to work within, what is the company or organization really comfortable with, what can they actually withstand. Understanding those bounds and those ranges is really important for escalation and for putting things in context. The other thing I'd point out is it helps me to think about the differences in the roles between your executives and the board, as the executives are the ones where you're really supporting their decision making with your risk analysis. And the board isn't so much in the decision making mode, they're in the oversight of our framework and how we made those decisions and how we are supporting that. So you may not want to just repackage everything you're bringing to your executives and send that to the board as well, because it is a different audience and they have a different role. So you want to make sure that it's tailored to that and their role that James mentioned.
And Julian, let me just give you a practical example of how this works. So when I was the chair of the risk committee at E-Trade, the CISO and CRO presented a report, and one of the metrics was our phishing fail rate, and it was about 14–15%, and it had a green. And then I said, well, what's the industry average? It's about 14–15%. I said, gosh, 14–15% times the number of employees is a lot of fails, right? Industry average sucks, okay? It's not where we want to be. It's not acceptable to me as a risk committee chair that we have so many, fails. So we said, let's think about an appropriate risk appetite tolerances, and then we agreed on 5%, right? Let's just start there. And then within 8 months, we did an enterprise-wide training program. Every employee went through it. We drove the phishing fail rate down to 3% in eight months. So I think that's a really good example of setting up a risk appetite tolerance, measuring it, taking action, and mitigating the risk in a substantial way.
And James, I think you referred, interestingly, to one of the other comments in the NSAD book, which is about collaborating with the other stakeholders. Actually, cyber risk isn't just something that the CISO should be seen to be owning. It talks about chief risk officers, chief trust officers, chief privacy officers, collaborating with all of them. How do you see that working in organizations nowadays?
Yeah, I think it's a team sport, and collaboration is important. And it's the premise of enterprise risk management, that you cannot manage risk in silos, and that includes cyber risk, right? So cyber risk, how does it impact your operational risk, third-party risk management, supply chain? How does that impact your strategy? And then how do you facilitate the collaboration within the organization? Because the CISO doesn't make all the risk management decisions, right? So let's say you want to put in a new patch or some new control, and that's going to slow down the performance of the system. Well, what if the chief operating officer or the business manager says, no, we don't want that? Well, who's going to make that risk acceptance decision? And that's a really important governance and policy question, right? So there's collaboration's important, conflicts are important. How do we resolve conflicts? And who makes the right decisions? So for example, right, in terms of decisions and actions, you guys notice that we have individual mics today as opposed to yesterday. We passed around one mic, and then this morning I said, well, why do we pass around mics? That's not good. One's not COVID safe. I know Biden says the pandemic's over, but I'm not sure, all the risk is gone, right? And it's not good operational risk, right? What if, one of the mics, so anyway, we got mics. So I did my job today.
Well done.
In terms of risk assessment and management. But, joking aside, I think one of the key points Jack made in his speech is about decision making. Okay, so the board's role is to oversee the decision of management, making sure it's appropriate and adequate. And so whatever work that you do, if it doesn't drive toward decision making, it might be interesting, it might be informative, but it's not useful. And what you want to aim for is being useful, meaning impacting decisions and actions.
Yeah, and I actually had a very personal experience back in 2014 in terms of decision-making where a global oil and gas company was running a crisis simulation for 7 of their key IT service providers to come together. So I was asked to lead the IBM team doing that. And one of the scenarios for this exercise was a SAP portal had been compromised. And of course, the technical decision was, well, we need to take down the SAP portal then. Well, the business decision was this was processing billions of dollars of transactions. That was not going to be a technical decision as to who turned off that portal. But then who was in the organization actually going to make that decision? And that's one of the things where actually these scenarios need to be worked through beforehand. You do not want to have to try and work through that decision when it's happening for real. So, Michael, what's your experience of working with the other stakeholders across your organization?
I think it kind of builds off of the last question as well, is we often think of risk appetite at only the organizational level, but really risk appetite needs to also be developed within each of your lines of business. Historically, cybersecurity and information security has been a very binary decision for a lot of organizations where they take something to security and they say, hey, can we do this? And then they get a yes or no from the CISO. And we've realized over the past couple decades that's a terrible operating model, and it slows the business down and it doesn't actually improve the security posture very much. And so what we're moving towards now, and FAIR is a huge part of this, is being able to partner across the organization and become consultants, essentially, for the business, the line of business owners, where they can say, this is my risk appetite for my line of business, and then we work with their line of business to mitigate or transfer risks that exceed the appetite for their line of business. And so it's important that partnership becomes very consultative in nature, because then we're not the office of no anymore. We're now a partner in helping them achieve their business objectives and bring risks within the tolerance that their leader set, not that the CISO set, et cetera. And in your example, Julian, in the scenario that you went through, that decision absolutely has to be made by the business owner who owns that SAP portal. Nobody would want the CISO making that decision. But the CISO is responsible for ensuring that the owner of that SAP portal has enough context and has enough information to make an informed decision. And when we shift our focus from making the decision to assisting making an informed decision, it's a really powerful mindset shift for your entire security team. And those partnerships build very organically when you start to take that mindset and that approach.
Thank you. Evan, how do the partnerships go in your organization across this group of stakeholders?
Well, I think there's a couple of constructs in our field that are a bit artificial, and trying to put hard lines around what is cyber risk and differentiate that from all the other risks, I think is very difficult and probably not that helpful in the end. When it really comes down to it, there's a lot of overlap. And I see in a lot of organizations, for example, cyber kind of overshadows some of the technology operational risks, for example. And that's a shame in a way, because although we need to get much better at our cyber posture and understanding cyber risk, FAIR, the reason I keep coming back to FAIR is because it works for all operational risk stripes. It works for technology risk, it works for privacy, it works for your traditional operational risk. It's very flexible in that way. And when you start to see that adoption across different risk stripes, and often the cyber team can be kind of the advocates showing that there's a better way to do things and answer some of the hard questions that they've been grappling with, such as how to set risk appetite or how to evaluate control, strength, or those sorts of things that they kind of hand wave over today a little bit with kind of typical conventions that we've all gotten comfortable with. And FAIR can answer that. So if you can find advocates in other risk stripes that are having similar problems and show them what you're doing in the cyberspace, it can be abstracted to work for them as well. And then when you get to the board level, they start to see cohesion and a consistency in how things are being presented, and they can be compared and they can be normalized. And for me, that's really the end state that I get excited about, is when we can really look at all these risks side by side and really truly compare them and look at the trade-offs and have those discussions about what we're trading off between them. That's kind of my utopia.
Thank you. I've got one more question, but then if we've got any questions anybody is asking, please put them on the website. So Michael, we talked over the last day or so about sometimes people in the board are going to challenge your findings. What's your experience there in being challenged by a board member and having to explain your findings?
Echoing what Jack talked about during his talk, I think challenges are better. They make you better, they make the board better, they make the organization better. And so I think it's important that we lean directly into those and welcome them and encourage them, honestly, is open things up, encourage the board members to disagree, to challenge your findings. Specifically in our FAIR adoption, we get challenged from our executive team, from directors, from our board of directors, et cetera, all around the types of findings that we come up with, the numbers that we got, and we're able to talk about, again, the assumptions and the data inputs that went into that, And so when you open it up for those types of challenges, you're able to talk about where the data came from and have more robust conversations, as opposed to when you're using qualitative approaches, it turns into religious arguments almost immediately. So the more you can talk about the data inputs and the assumptions that were made in your model, it's going to make you better, and it's also going to make them better. The other piece of the challenges that I think is important is to remember that it is also our job to educate our board and educate other executives. Again, this is not something that most people are going to inherently be focused on, and so they want to be educated. You mentioned how popular the NACD guide has become. They want to be educated, and so sometimes we've been challenged around where a board member wants metrics that are not valuable. For instance, one of our board members asked us to provide a metric of how many times the health system is attacked every day. And he used a very loose definition of what qualifies as an attack. And so I had to help educate them on that's not meaningful. There's no decision that you're going to be able to make using that metric. There's nothing that it's going to do to inform you about our risk posture. There's nothing that it's going to do to inform about our defense posture. And so when we're able to sit down and talk about what he's actually trying to get, what he's actually trying to understand, and what decisions he's trying to make, then we can have a talk about what metrics would actually inform that decision, and how can you actually, excuse me, how can you actually get to where you're trying to go instead of just handing you the metric that you think you wanted.
Thanks, Michael. I think you've actually just answered one of the questions that there was a question here. What's your experience, Evan? Have you been challenged by board members and had to justify the basis for the decisions?
Yeah, certainly. There's an interesting dynamic whenever you put something quantitative in front of people, that they challenge it more than they challenged the generic qualitative things that you gave them before, and I think that's all healthy and it's good. In the organization I'm at now, we do murder board like prep for a lot of the regulatory and executive sessions that we do, and our executives welcome everyone to come in and just ask them hard questions and help them prep for those conversations. I think it's a good practice to have, to be constantly challenging yourself and leaning on your team to ask you some of those hard questions so you can get comfortable answering them and be able to defend it better.
Thank you. So coming back to the topic of risk appetite, we've got a question here. How do you start a conversation around risk appetite with your board when the company does not have a risk appetite statement or a BCP program? What would be your recommendation there, James?
I think you start with the process of asking what is the appropriate risk appetite for a specific risk, right? So generally you have strategic, operational, financial, compliance, and even reputational risk. And cyber is a subset of operational risk. So, of the critical risks within the company, what's our appropriate risk appetite and what are the right metrics? You just have to start somewhere. And usually takes a few iterations to get to a place where you're really happy with what you have. So don't let perfect get in the way of good, right? Just start with a draft and improve on that. It's an iterative process. But I think it also relates to this question about challenge, because once you lay out a metric and a risk appetite tolerance, you're going to be challenged around that. And you're going to be challenged even before you go to the boardroom, right? The first challenge I think many of you experience is from the GC, right? The general counsel. Oh, wait a minute, we're going to put this on a piece of paper? Are you kidding me, right? So the GC wants to reduce the litigation risk in terms of exposure. And I've seen this for decades, right? And I would say, one, there's really no case law that I know of that any GC could point to that basically says, oh, you have higher liability because you have good metrics and that you have good risk appetite statement and reporting to the board. There's a lot of case law where the board's not getting the right metrics and reports and early warning indicators, like Boeing, like Marchand, like Clovis, just in recent years, that basically says if the board's not getting the right metrics, they are exposed to higher liability. The second thing I would say is when you do, and you have to kind of empathize with the GC, that if you're going to show information to the board where you're exceeding risk appetite, then the question is, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about risk reduction within your risk appetite? And I'll give you a very specific example. So when we were on the E-Trade board, I chaired the risk committee. The cyber and risk management team did an evaluation, independent evaluation. They picked the FAIR model. They picked the Risk Lens platform. And they produced some analysis in terms of potential loss. It was really good information. But in terms of the board, so let's say you overcome the GC challenge. Now you go to the board challenge. So you're going to get a pretty big number. Then you have to say, well, how do we think about that number? Is that number appropriate? And if that number is too large, what are we doing to reduce that number to an appropriate level, which speaks to risk appetite? So I think, as Jack said, you got to do your homework. Expect a challenge from the GC, expect a challenge from the board, and be able to defend, what are you going to do and why that's appropriate for the organization.
One exercise I would suggest is a very simple one, is if you're really starting from scratch, like you have no risk appetite in the organization or anything like that, pick a scenario of something playing out, key business service being down, something being compromised, and walk the board through it and ask them a simple question like, as described, how quickly would you want to be notified of this? And kind of ratchet it up and ratchet it down. And sometimes that is a good exercise to start to get them to think about, like, you're the chair of the risk committee. Would you like to be woken up in the middle of the night to know about this immediately? Or can you wait till tomorrow morning? Or can it wait till the next board meeting kind of thing? And that's a bit of a proxy sometimes to gauge people's tolerance for some of that risk.
That's excellent too, because we often think of risk appetite as something that you have to start with your statement, and oftentimes you can back into it exactly like you're talking about. There was an old adage that not that many people are creators, but everyone's a critic, and so sometimes just putting something out there, it starts the conversation where you can start to say, no, actually I don't want to know about that, or yes, I do want to know about that. No, that's too much loss. And so you can back into a risk appetite statement even without a BIA in place. It's never going to be as accurate and well informed as a good business impact analysis would be, but at least everyone will be on the same page as far as how things are going to operate and what the board is expecting from an oversight and appetite perspective.
And then if you get Michael's example where the board member says, I want to be woken up every time we get attacked, and then you can bring out your metric and say, well, that's 10,000 times a day.
Absolutely. That might simplify the conversation quite a lot. Thank you very much, James. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Evan, for sharing your experience. I really think this is a very relevant topic that many of us are seeing, so thank you very much indeed for sharing your experience.